Hello and welcome. Donald Trump winning the American presidential elections adds a heightened element of uncertainty about what happens next to the global economy, to the stock markets. To talk about this and more, and to try and understand what this happens and what this fundamentally means for America and the rest of the world, I've got one of the world's top investors, authors, analysts, Ruchir Sharma, joining us in Mumbai. Thank you very much, Ruchir, for joining us. You are tracking the American presidential elections very closely. Can you begin by trying to explain why you think Donald Trump won? If there had been another candidate contesting in place of Kamala Harris, if Biden had moved away earlier, could the result have been different? Or do you think the underlying economic parameters were such that no matter what happened, this is the end outcome that would have resulted?
Yes, I think because let's put this in some context out here. As you know, this is the biggest year for democracy ever. There are about 70 elections being held around the world. And the data that I've shown shows that since about 1800, there's never been a bigger year for democracy. So it's a huge year for democracy. Let's look at the results which have already come in for about, of the 70 odd elections that we have had across the world. In the developed world, only 20% of the incumbents have actually won their election. And so it shows there's a huge anti-incumbency wave that's running through the world currently. And even if you look at the White House, this is for the first time in over a century that the incumbent party has lost 3 elections in a row. You had the defeat of the Democrat Party after Obama. Then even Trump lost in 2020. And now you've had an instance where the Democrat Party under Kamala Harris has lost. So I think there's a broad pattern out here that this is a protest vote. This is what you call an anti-incumbency wave, a term we are very familiar in India with. But now this term, I think, has gone global. And I think that for me is the single overriding reason for Trump's victory. And we need to interpret, and even Trump for that matter, I think needs to interpret the mandate that way, that this is not ideological. There's a lot of talk that this is the rise of the right, rise of strongmen and stuff. It's not true, because even like in some countries, the so-called strongmen, whether previously it was Brazil or wherever, they lost their election. So I'm less willing to view this election from an ideological prism, much more from the fact that you have a protest vote. And why the protest vote is taking place is because in the developed world in particular, for the average person, capitalism or the current economic system that you have is not working for them. Even in America, the most telling statistic was the fact that 2/3 of the country felt that the nation was moving in the wrong direction. 70% of people in America felt that the system needs to be toned down or something dramatic needs to be done. So this is a vote against the current system. It's a protest vote. It's an anti-incumbency wave that's being stoked by this huge sense of dissatisfaction.
So let's spend a moment talking about what is most likely to happen next, because that's what everyone's really interested in. Trump said a lot of things during the campaign, including potentially taking tariffs up to 60% with China. Now, there are 2 ways of looking at it. One, that this is a maneuver to negotiate, and he's a good salesman, he likes to do deals, and therefore he's trying to browbeat his opponents. The other is, this is exactly what he intends to do. Now he has the mandate, he has the Senate and most of the Congress to enable him in that path. What do you think will happen?
Well, firstly, as far as tariffs are concerned, he doesn't even need the Congress for that, because that's an executive authority. Where he needs the Congress, this is for him to pass his tax cuts and more of the fiscal position. So I think it's important to distinguish the two. Now, I think that as far as tariffs are concerned, he's going to definitely do more than last time. But it's very hard to know that how much of this is bluster and how much he's going to negotiate. Like take the case of Mexico. On one hand, it's the easiest country to target. That it's Mexico, it's in your border, you just target, you do tariffs. But he also needs Mexico to prevent this immigration from taking place. Because if he can strike a deal with Mexico where he says that, hey, I'm not going to sort of do much with tariffs with you, but in return what I want from you is to make sure that you seal your border properly, then I think with Mexico, the deal will be very different. So the essence of the Trump administration is going to be very transactional. It's a very deal-making kind of orientation. And some of the people I've spoken to when I was there in America who are part of his circle, I think that they also feel the same way, that these are all negotiating positions, and that if he can cut a deal and show that he's coming out as a winner, especially for America on the back of a deal, he's going to do that. So it's very hard to sort of sit here and have a baseline and say, okay, that tariffs are going to go to 60% on China and stuff. He's going to start like with dramatic stuff, but where he settles is very different.
What interests us the most is the impact that this trade tension between China and the United States could have on India. So whether tariffs are increased by 60% or more moderately, there will be heightened trade tensions likely between Beijing and DC. How does that play out from an Indian prism?
Yeah, I think as far as India is concerned, we are largely a bystander in this, which is that even in the campaign, if you look at it, India was barely mentioned. A couple of times we were mentioned, it made headlines here. But if you really track it from an American perspective, it was barely mentioned. If anything, in America, the Indian brand today is very strong. It's largely associated as these very successful immigrants who have come, even though India, I think, is the source of the second largest contingent of illegal immigrants even. But generally, the Indian brand is strong. It's, all these successful CEOs and all from India. So I think that India is largely a bystander. All the countries that were mentioned in this campaign were done so in a negative way.
But he did call India a tariff king.
Yeah, I mean, those are like these throwaway comments. I don't think I would take them very seriously. So I think as far as India is concerned, we have to sort of just watch the situation. But one thing in India that I want to be careful about is that there's also been some talk currently about the great relationship between Trump and Modi and stuff, which may be the case. But I think we have to understand that the essence is transactional. I think America has just become a much less dependable ally currently. That tomorrow, if America sees in its interest to cut a deal with China, for whatever reason, they're not going to think about, India is our ally, how is it going to have an impact on India? We are in a world today where everyone is thinking purely in terms of their self-interest. So I think that as far as India is concerned, we've got to understand that we've got to keep doing what's been done. In the last few years, there's been a much greater strategic relationship between India and America. But under the Trump administration, we have to be prepared for very transactional approaches where he may sort of decide tomorrow if he has to strike a deal with some country because it's in that country's interest or in America's interest at that point in time. He's not going to care that, how's India going to feel as a strategic ally? I think those days are gone.
No, we've already seen a lot of foreign portfolio investment leave the Indian markets. Now with Trump putting so much emphasis on manufacture in the United States, it's likely that some of these FIIs feel it worthwhile staying in the US. The BSE already below the 80,000 mark. How do you see the outlook for the Indian markets in the medium, short and long?
Well, the problem that's happened around the world, if you look at the last, I'd say, and this predates even the last few months where we've seen a lot of foreign selling, is that the last 15 years, really, the post-global financial crisis world, from a financial perspective, has been entirely dominated by America. Mm-hmm. That today, if you look at America today, its economic size in the global economy is about 28% or so. But if you look at the stock market indices around the world, 60%. America is now approaching 65%. So it's been a last 10 to 15 years where America has totally dominated as a financial superpower and a lot of American investors and everyone feels that if we have to get global exposure, we might as well buy these Microsofts and Google and stuff because they're getting their exposure from international lot now. So I think the big challenge that India and other emerging markets are facing, and this is something which I sort of encounter as well, is that there is zero interest in international in America today from an investing perspective.
Zero interest?
Absolutely. Nobody, because they look at the returns over the last 10 to 15 years and they feel that the American stock market has given us these incredible returns. No other country in the world has been able to stand up to it. India is the best performing emerging market and its returns are barely the same as America. Mm-hmm. But obviously people see much greater risk in going abroad. Sure. So they don't feel that you're being compensated enough for the risk that you're taking. So the real challenge is that when will this turn? So I think that unfortunately we're in a paradigm today where you need something to crack in America, which is that because of the fiscal situation they have, where they're running these massive budget deficits, if or if the dollar starts to weaken because people begin to lose confidence in America's ability to finance its deficit, unless something like that happens, America and the world is going to remain very obsessed with just US investments, and the prospect for foreign flows coming into these countries will remain pretty grim. Now, I'm hopeful that this can't continue. How can one country be 65% of the world's stock market capitalization. Something will happen to change it. And we see
what
this
kind of time frame? Because there are a couple of factors at play. One, we're seeing countries like Russia, China work towards de-dollarization, trying to build up what they call like a purported BRICS currency. Those
Right.
ideas have never really worked in the past.
Right.
Could they potentially work? And the fact is, post the sanctions on Russia, there's now genuine concern about keeping a lot of your foreign exchange outside in dollars, because you can't really trust the United States, and that's weighing on minds in
Yes.
Beijing and elsewhere.
Yes.
So how do you see this play out? The fact is that the US is running up incredibly high deficits, and both Harris and Trump, if they were aligned on anything, it was on the need to continue, government spending.
Exactly. So I think this process of moving to a currency away from the dollar is a very long-term process. That started. I think that, with the sanctions on Russia and stuff, that process started, where countries felt that we can't be that dependent on the dollar, from a economic system. But I think that the real issue is going to be that when is the global marketplace going to start caring about these incredible American deficits? And the data here is really staggering, which is the fact that America today is running a budget deficit of more than 6% of GDP. There is no other developed country or OECD country, as they call them, which is running a budget deficit as large as America today. Now that in the short term is artificially boosting economic growth. When you run such a large deficit and stuff, it boosts like economic growth. But when is the attention going to turn that this is not sustainable? If any other country in the world today was running the kind of debt and deficits that America is running, and where the trajectory just seems to be so sort of high, that country would be in trouble. And every other country in the last few years has faced some sort of backlash from the bond market whenever they've run such high deficits. It used to be said that this is an emerging market problem, but no, UK, France, where the budget deficit has also been approaching 6% of GDP, they've been facing a lot of pushback and they've been increased taxes and cut spending. So I think that the key issue for the next year is going to be that when does the American bond market say, and that's the only check and balance today left on Trump. In a way that you can argue that given the mandate he got, there's no check and balance really left in some ways, because now the Congress is totally aligned with him, with both the House and the Senate likely going in his corner. Some people would make the argument that even the Supreme Court is ideologically more aligned with him. So I think the untold story of this election just now is that there's only one check and balance in a way which is left. And that for me is the bond market. That when does the US bond market...
What's your understanding of bond traders? I mean, usually they're very vigilante like
Exactly.
in other countries. Do you think they'll get more
I think so.
vigilant about what's happening in the US? Because they also print the dollar, so they have that advantage.
Exactly. But that advantage, I think, is has already been used up, which is the fact that that there's a limit to which you can keep doing this. America used to run budget deficits about 3% of GDP for the last 20 years. In the in fact, I've got this amazing statistic which always stays with me, that America, in its first nearly 250 years since independence, accumulated about $17 trillion in debt. In the last 10 years, they've accumulated another $17 trillion in debt. So this trajectory has really gone vertical. And I think that this is where the big risk lies for America. And my suspicion is that in the next few months, possibly in 2025, I think that the bond market is going to start to revolt, because they're going to see that Trump's going to keep pushing for more tax cuts or letting spending increase, because there's no incentive for him not to do that until the bond market revolts. Why should a politician stop? Even in India's case or any case, the only check and balance really comes is because they understand that if interest rates go up or if the bond market begins to revolt, we can't do all this.
No, but the big difference in India is that Modi by instinct seems to be a fiscal conservative. At least he'd like to be now. Sometimes there are political compulsions, but he doesn't want to run up these big deficits, and that's what his government has shown over the past 10 years.
Yes, that's right. Because I think that they see India's history. They see like in the past when, like in 2012, 2013, what happened. When our fiscal situation went out of control. They understand that India, they don't want to have India be seen as vulnerable.
Sure.
America doesn't face that, because so far they've run these massive deficits and they never faced a problem. India's faced a problem in the past. Whenever they've run a deficit, there's been a sort of feeling that, hey, that this can't be sustainable, and other countries in the world too feel that. In fact, my sort of big case is the fact that if you look at most emerging markets today, they are being fiscally responsible. They have changed their habits. But in America's case, it's gone the other way, because there's been no pushback ever.
So you made the point that there's zero interest in foreign investors, particularly in the United States, but wanting to invest in the Indian markets. A lot of the growth that we've seen in Indian markets has been supported by domestic financial institutions, particularly mutual funds.
Yes.
Price earning ratios already quite heated. So given this context, what's your outlook for what you think is most likely to be the trajectory of the markets in the next few months?
Well, I think that it's going to be a bit challenging until, like we sort of see this thing turn, which is that the one variable that that every investor in India should look at as to when foreign flows will start coming back into India is when the dollar turns. That until and unless the dollar starts to weaken, then that's when I think foreign investors will return. Like all this other talk that, China's done a big stimulus, some money will go there. I think this is all short-term fluff. Because I don't think that's like sustainable. I don't think China's growth story is so sustainable that people are going to reallocate capital to China, move away from India. I just don't think that's going to happen. But I think that what needs to be done out here is that when the dollar does start to weaken, that's when you'll see foreign inflows come into here. And remember that India is that India is one of the best performing emerging markets in the world. So there's, like in India's case, at least there's some interest when you talk to people, but generally the interest of American investors where the large pools of capital lie in going international currently is close to zero. That's the point I'm making.
Let's spend a moment on the Chinese economy.
Yes.
They've put out stimulus. Some people think it wasn't as extravagant as it could have been and that there's more coming. And then there's also talk of a lot of distress in the economy.
Yes.
Given that economic data in China is largely a black hole, what's your reading of just how bad the situation in China is?
Oh, the situation is very bad. They have a full-fledged property crisis which is going on. What they're trying to do now is to stabilize the property market. But remember, even China has run up massive debt and deficits. If you look at China's total debt, both public sector and private sector, it's about 300% of GDP. So they're a heavily indebted nation. And the other big problem China faces is demographics. Over the next 10 years, China is going to lose 6 to 7 million people every year in the workforce. So, like in the next 10 years, you're going to lose up to 70 million people. And that's a huge amount of loss. So when you have demographics which are this negative, it's very hard for a country to grow in any meaningful way. So my bet is that I don't think China grows at a rate of more than maybe 2.5% a year for the next decade. Now, what the stimulus and all can do is to try and stabilize the situation where there's no outright financial crisis.
I was speaking to Ian Bremmer at the Eurasia Group, and he made the point that Beijing is likely to make overtures to India over the next several months to try and improve the strained relationship, largely on account of Trump's triumphalism or his posturing. The big debate in India is how should Delhi respond? The Ministry of External Affairs and the Ministry of Defense have a certain point of view. Commerce and Industry has a different point of view. India Inc. has a different point of view. How would you see it, and how does India extract the maximum for itself given the dynamic that's at play?
I think that India has got to remain neutral in this because, as I said, with Trump, I keep using the word repeatedly, the approach is very transactional. There's nothing strategic, which is the fact that tomorrow, let's say that we say that, okay, we don't want to deal with China because we trust America more, and we're going to sort of do everything with America here, and like these overtures from China cannot be trusted.
I don't think Modi trusts anyone.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm saying that, let's just say that happens. The only risk with getting too closely aligned to America is that tomorrow, if America strikes a deal with China, where sort of, they have like China strikes a deal with them where they sort of do something, then America can easily leave India out in the cold. So I just don't trust the fact there's anything strategic going on. It's all transactional is the point I'm trying to make. So therefore, I think that we have to keep our options open and we cannot throw
so
our
my
weight.
question is, do you see more Chinese foreign investment, whether it is FDI, whether it is technical manpower, which India Inc.'s been looking out for? Do you think it's okay and kosher to bring that in, or do we continue to remain highly suspicious given what happened in Galwan and after that?
No, I think that more than that, my big risk with China today is the following, which I think many countries are facing, that they have huge amounts of overcapacity, that the demand's not there in China and they've built up this massive overcapacity and they're exporting that overcapacity, and that is very deflationary and that can hurt a lot of people, including Indian businesses. So I think we have to remain a bit vigilant about that they have really sort of, got overcapacity in solar, EVs, all these industries, they've built massive overcapacity and this demand's not there. So I'm much more concerned by the fact that how could this dumping impact us and which businesses can get hurt by this. And I think that's what we have to remain vigilant about. And that's what I think many countries in the world are going to be much more vigilant. And that's what America too is not going to tolerate, this kind of, because if you look at the Chinese growth model in the last few years, whatever economic growth they've got has primarily been led by exports. So that's the irony of it, that on one level, China, you want, like in terms of you are blaming for, like this tariff wars and stuff in a way because they've been exporting so much. But on the other hand, their exports have gone up even more in the last few years. And I think that dumping and that overcapacity in China, which is built, that being pushed out to the global markets is a big risk.
Ruchir, we're currently in Mumbai, walking on the Marine Drive. There's a big election in Maharashtra in a few weeks from now. And I won't ask you to hazard a guess on who's winning, because that's now seriously dangerous. But that being said, what's your interpretation of the verdict in Haryana and the likely impact on what's happening in Maharashtra and Jharkhand?
Just having tracked Indian elections, as you know, we spoke last time, like on your channel when I'd finished my election trip in India for the national elections in May. And we had traveled in Maharashtra also back then. In terms of the fact that if I look at, I haven't traveled this time on any election trip, so I have no real independent ground feel. But just a couple of observations if I can make here, which is generally, if you look at the pattern of Indian elections, what happens in like a Lok Sabha election, if there's a state election being held, within 6 to 12 months of that, the pattern tends to repeat itself. So that's the only pattern we can do, and nothing has changed in terms of alliances and stuff significantly since then. So you would expect the pattern to repeat itself.
Momentum has post Haryana.
Yeah.
Earlier there was a sense that the BJP is going down, Modi's graph is sinking.
I don't believe in this momentum theory.
Why not?
Because I believe in India, each state election is very distinct. If momentum was the issue, then BJP would have never won Haryana because the momentum was so against it in terms of that, right? So I'd say that each state election tends to be distinct in India. We are truly a federal country now, and every state election,
So your sense is that the 31-17 trend, which we saw during the Lok Sabha elections of 48 seats in Maharashtra, is likely to continue?
No, I'm just trying to say based on historical pattern. I haven't traveled this time. Last time we traveled, we came back with an assessment. I was very vocal about it, that we did not see a Modi wave after the election in May when we traveled. I haven't traveled. Now you ask me to make an assessment based on not having traveled, based on data I can do it. Even in Haryana, it's interesting to note that it was two things about Haryana, just watching it from a distance. One, that it was possibly the freakiest election result I've ever seen in India. Freakiest because not only were the exit polls wrong, there was not one journalist who came back from Haryana and said, hey, something different may happen. I don't think there was one BJP person who came back and said something different may happen privately.
Why do you think that's the case? What's your assessment?
I just don't know what happened. Sometimes these freaks happen, but not one person came back, and you'll agree with that. That not one person came back and said, or even a BJP insider said, just wait and watch, something different may happen. Usually, how it is, that even when people are losing elections, they come and tell you, hey, just wait and watch for election day. It's seemed like there was complete capitulation, and then all of a sudden something happened, which we don't, where there's a lot of post-facto analysis about that, but I don't think anyone really knows what happened in that election, and not enough has been done. Even I wish all the exit pollsters would sit down and say what happened. I don't think there's been enough of serious introspection about that. But even having said all that, despite that being the freakiest election where not one person told you something different may happen, in fact, they told you that a landslide was a given. It was, what's the margin was the only sort of thing that landslide for the Congress is given. I think that the only thing which I will say is that even in the Haryana, roughly what happened in the Lok Sabha election roughly did repeat itself in the assembly election also. It's not as if the results of the Lok Sabha and the assembly were very different. Just that people were expecting that it's going to be a much bigger landslide. Modi is not on the ticket, and it's going to be, and the Congress is tapping into the resentment a lot more. So I think that's the way. So I'm saying that I'm just talking about general election theories, which is that in India's case, every election is independent. Generally, when an election is held between 6 to 12 months, this is what I've learned from the pollsters I travel with, you have a similar pattern. But as I said, I've not traveled this time. I don't have an independent feel for it.
Looked at from the outside, what are you making of the policy moves that we've seen from the Modi government post the 4th of June? And how is this appearing to you to be different from Modi's agenda in the past 2 terms?
I don't think, I think what's clearly happened is that across India, whether it's Modi or stuff, there's a slight shift taking place where, like, earlier the focus was very much on infrastructure build out, development. Clearly, the tendency for giving more subsidies or more handouts has increased.
How dangerous is that for India at its current state of economic evolution?
It's absolutely a factor which will undermine our economic growth, because as I've argued in the past, that China is a great success story for 30, 40 years when it was growing very rapidly, was to spend all its money on infrastructure build-outs and very little on any welfareism.
But the fear with that is that with all the infrastructure build-outs, income disparities keep increasing, right? The rich keep getting richer, the poor keep getting poorer, and then not you, but other critics of the Modi government would say, hey, so the Ambanis and the Adanis are getting richer, in Garibo ka dekho, and then Rahul Gandhi gets something to wave around. So that's the political reality that Prime Minister Modi and his government are trying to deal with.
Yes, that's right. So I think that in India's case, if you ask me the biggest risk, it is that of competitive populism. That's something we've spoken about in the past. The only good thing in India is that everything, it changes very slowly. So even when someone wants to do competitive populism, how to implement it, what to do, it tends to be very slower. And then, like, the big lucky thing happened to us when they did, for a while at least in like 03 to 07, when they went wild on welfareism and populism, was that economic growth was so strong that, in fact, even then, until the economy slowed down, they were able to get away with it. So I think that,
speaking of slowing economy, a lot of talk in the months in the past was about rural distress. Now,
Yes.
there are signs of that turning, but now the focus is on urban distress, right? So
Yeah.
how acute is that in your view, and how much is that likely to slow India's economic growth?
well, I think as far as I've said about India, and I've said this consistently, that my favorite line on India, which I know I've always said, that this is a country that consistently disappoints the optimists and the pessimists. I'm generally on the optimistic side, but I do feel the fact that, that in India's case, this will happen, which is that's why we'll never grow at 9 or 10%. There will always be some factor pulling us back, pulling us down, whether it's competitive populism or it's this, mixed changes from rural to urban back to rural. But a 6% type growth trajectory for me, for India, still seems okay, unless we do something really disastrous to damage it. And that much faith I have that enough state governments also are generally investment friendly now. So for them to damage this so badly, I think, to me, is not something that is my base case.
During the campaign, Ruchir, we saw billionaire investor Elon Musk play an outsized role in the Trump campaign. A lot of people are calling this a very sharp investment. How is this most likely to play out for Musk and for all of us?
No, I think that, firstly, Musk can't formally join, but I think that this is, like a lot of people have conspiracy theories about these things. I don't believe in conspiracy theories. This is just in terms of, he is a bit of a freaky character, and this is the kind of stuff that he likes to do. But I think it's very important to, possibly for me, when we travel, we try and look for one quote which defines the election for you. And I spoke to a lot of people this time, when I was in New York and other places, when the election was happening, but that was the only conversation that would happen. I think that the most defining quote, which explains as to why so many billionaires and so many people lined up behind Trump this time, is what a person told me, who's a very famous investment banker, that, he was, of course, railing to me in private about how, Trump's totally unpredictable. He's he's totally over the top and all that. So then I asked him, finally, who will you vote for if that's your assessment of Trump? And then he looks at me and says, I would rather vote for a crazy capitalist than an organized socialist. So I think that is what for me was almost like the defining, sort of thing, that why are so many people who are, in terms of who see Trump's eccentricities and craziness, why are they voting for him? Especially in places like, the financial capitals and stuff like New York. And this statement that for some reason he is perceived as being more of a capitalist because he talks more about deregulation, he talks about lower taxes, he doesn't attack businesses in a generic way that the Biden-Harris administration did. So I think that thought process played a big role, at least in some of these very influential people, including Musk, aligning themselves with Trump rather than the other way around.
For a while it seemed, Ruchir, that cryptocurrencies seem to be heading down. A lot of the naysayers said, well, we told you so, the bubble's bust.
Yeah.
We're seeing now Donald Trump, especially from the past, talk up bitcoins and cryptocurrency. How do you see that impacting cryptocurrencies as an asset class in the months to come?
No, I think we have to put this again in context, which is that the point that I've been making is that people are looking for alternatives to the US dollar. And they have not been able to find it in other currencies because whether it's the Chinese currency or the euro, they face even bigger problems than America does. So the default option for them have been two. One is gold, and second has been Bitcoin and crypto as alternative asset classes. So I think that's what's going on because remember, a lot of people also who were bullish on crypto said that this would replace gold. Instead, gold has done equally well this year or almost as well as crypto has done.
So do you see over the past 4 years, especially with a supportive president, which I suppose would at some level impact policy as well in the United States and have a ripple effect globally, do you see cryptocurrencies emerge as a more robust, more meaningful asset class?
It already has. You know, I think
beyond where we are.
Yeah, in terms of the fact that I think it's here to stay, which is that crypto is like here to stay. Sure, there's a lot of speculative fluff which has been built up on the price, but I think as an asset class, it's here to stay. And I think that it's along with gold, you know, these are long-term trends, which is that their allocation to within portfolios is bound to increase. Now, where crypto, I'd written a piece, in fact, earlier this year, saying two cheers for the crypto bulls. That one, that crypto has lasted much longer than what the bears had said. Two, the price has done very well. The only negative about crypto and Bitcoin, I'll say so far, is that a lot of people thought that this could be used in transactions. That's not happening. That, you know,
you see that change?
No, I'm not seeing any sign of that. So it's become an asset class, but as a transaction medium, crypto really hasn't picked up. So I think that's been the one disappointment, but broadly it's been there. So I think that these are alternatives to the dollar which are building quietly and slowly, but more as an asset class. As a transaction use, crypto has still not gained much currency.
Finally, in India and outside, what are the three big risks you are tracking which you think investors and everyone watching you at this time need to be most mindful about?
I think that the big risk, if you ask me, is the fact that what surprised me, to be honest, is the fact that the US economy continues to grow at this incredible pace. You know, for 9 quarters in a row now, they've grown at a pace of nearly 3%. So at the surface, things look okay. Beneath the surface, I think there's a lot of unrest, which I've spoken about. The fact that, like a big theme of this election was the fact that, of the forgotten man, as they put it, which is that so many people in America today are disillusioned with the overall economic system or so. So my sort of thing is that if Trump decides that he needs to address this with even greater fiscal support in terms of that, then what happens with the deficit, and if interest rates around the world start to shoot up? I think that's the biggest risk I see for the US and for the global economy, that interest rates around the world begin to really rise a lot because America's deficit situation gets out of control.
And the risk for India?
And the risk for India is that for a while at least, when that happens, then even we are forced to, not cut rates, which we were willing to do, and that goes up. So until the dollar turns, if higher interest rates happen in the US, that translates to us as well. The second is obviously that he comes through on his tariff threats, because I think a lot of people today are discounting it, saying
which sectors could that impact the most in India in your view?
No, I think it's a sentiment stuff, which is the fact that, like if you start trade wars start happening around us, we are still relatively insulated because our share to global trade is not that high. But that's something which could be an impact at the margin, where the global economy itself weakens. And the third, the policies I'm talking about, is inflation. That given what's happening, what if this leads to higher inflation? With even China putting some stimulus now into place and stuff. Because one thing, like in the US, which was a factor in this election and continues to be, is that inflation's been much higher than any other precedent in recent history. Even this year, people talk about inflation coming down. Underlying inflation in the US is still running at about 3% higher than what it used to be when it was well below 2%. If the economy remains strong and you do more stimulus, then next year, could we get inflation of 3-4%? And then what happens to interest rates? I think so. If you ask me for the three risks, it's got to do with interest rates, it's got to do with inflation, and the fact that he comes through on his worst tariff threats. So I'd say those are the three big risks.
There are always interesting, original observations and insights when one speaks to you. Ruchir Sharma, for taking out time and joining us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rahul. Enjoyed that. Thank you.